So hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Walter. I'm a French user expert designer. I'm currently working in Luxembourg and I've been working in the UX field for a little bit more than 10 years. And currently I'm working for a big client, which is the European Investment Bank. And I'm working both on the user research and also on building a design system. So a few of the examples here are actually from like real project with real how do you do that in my experience with our clients. So a few years ago, we were building fixed websites. Like most designers went from a graphic design background. A lot of people came from the printing industry and technology was not really flexible. You would like design this page and have someone cut it into HTML and CSS, and that was done. Nothing was flexible, responsive. Then came along mobile phones, and we started asking ourselves, how are we going to make our content fits into those super small screens? And the solution was responsive web design. So this is the book written by Ethan Marcotti 10 years ago about responsive web design. Can you believe it's already have been 10 years? And for the last 10 years, we've been kind of building a website like that, like using CSS media queries to adapt the layout, the content on our website for something, and some specific breakpoints. The first question students or people I do consultancy with ask me is usually, okay, you got your design, what breakpoint do we use? What breakpoint do you recommend? And unfortunately, there's no perfect answer for that until you go in the browser. I think by now a lot of people get used to this, but I prefer to repeat it. So please don't define your breakpoints on exact width that you are trying to target. Try to base them on the layout, on the content, on what actually you want to display in those screens. Let's talk a little bit about going beyond those kind of arbitrary mobile sizes. So in my experience, while working with developers, I've kind of seen that we could split the concept of breakpoint in two main categories. The first one is major breakpoint or primary breakpoints, and those will be used to adapt the global layout, like shifting column, things like that. And then you have secondary breakpoints. Those will be used to adapt the design at component, at content level. So primary breakpoint will usually be your grid. If you remember Bootstrap and frameworks like that, you usually have those super big primary breakpoint where you say, okay, we have 2 columns, then we have 1 column, things like that. So those primary breakpoint, most of the time, they trigger major changes in your layout. Let's take an example of a cooking recipe website. I think it's almost lunchtime, so I hope I will not make you too hungry. So I have a page. It's a category page. So in this page, on desktop, I have 2 columns. On the left, I have my filter because I want to filter all of those cooking recipes, and I have my content on the right. What we usually do to build this kind of layout is we have 1 column on mobile, and most of the time you're going to hide this sidebar behind a button, so this toggle button. And then when the screen is, I don't know, 980 pixel wide, we say, okay, we shift this 1 column to 2 columns. So this is usually what I call primary breakpoints. So I want to put those some thumbnails into this page. So this is going to be the content of my page. Most of the time, designer will provide, I hope, 2 versions of the component, a mobile or small version, and a desktop or big version of the component. If you use primary breakpoint to do that, it looks something like that. So we have the small one on the left, with the kind of small version. And then when the viewport is 980 pixels or wider, we switch to the big one. Are good, right? Usually. The problem is as soon as you go into the browser, you end up with something like this. Like what happens in those in-betweens? What happens if it's a little bit almost big enough to switch the breakpoint, but not enough? And you end up with this kind of stretch, which is not really user-friendly, quite ugly. Also, you'll have problems with the thumbnail, which might stretch or have some issue with what is displayed actually, because the browser is going to decide the content is super wide, everything is floating around on the left. So this is not a really good experience. So this is usually when you want to say, okay, let's introduce secondary breakpoints. And those breakpoints are going to be used to adapt this specific layout for this component. And usually it's easier to decide those in the browsers because you put a breakpoint when the content breaks. And when I say break, I mean things overlap, or it's become hard to read, or images get a little bit strained, things like that. If I come back to my example now, I designed 3 of those. I designed the small version, the medium version, which will be for those in-betweens, and the large version. Small version will be used on the smaller viewports. Okay. Then let's say I'm going to switch this to medium version at 650. So here you see I don't have my layout breakpoints. I'm still having the same layout, like one column, toggle at the top, everything. I'm just like having a specific breakpoint that will be used to switch for this specific component at this size. And then I might say, okay, why wait until the content is super wide to change for the large? Maybe at some point we are going to change this in 820 pixels because around this breakpoint, the content is again starting to look really real, things like that. So if we come back to the desktop version, we end up with something like that. So my big screen here, I actually have 2 breakpoints for this layout. I have this primary breakpoint for the main layout to shifting from column, and I still have this secondary breakpoint, but you see, it's not the same one. Like I triggered the component switch a little bit earlier. So the question usually you want to ask by now is, okay, but how do we take design decisions like that? How do we decide to change this? What do we show in the big, the small components, things like that? And usually when I have to build responsive components, I start with content modeling. So if you think about my recipe teaser, it's composed of a lot of things. It has an image, it has a title, it has a category. I have ratings. Those ratings are themselves the components that could be cut into small pieces, stars, numbers of votes, an excerpt, a save button that again is composed of 2 things, an icon and a label. And then I have those metadata that have this kind of key value structure. So preparation time, cooking time, serving cost. And then I have invisible things. The invisible things here are the actions. So I have a save action that is going to save this recipe to whatever favorite recipe list I have. And then I have an open recipe detail, which will be triggered when I click on the whole tile. It's going to send me to the recipe page. And doing this really simple exercise of just like listing all of your content will help a lot of people. It usually helps the designer to make sure that we don't forget anything in the component and we don't come back like 3 weeks after saying, oh, actually, you know, you forgot, we need that and that in the component. And then it also helps developers understand the model. Like if some content comes from different API, they need to fetch it from different places. It will help them understand the different system they need to fetch, and also help them understand the relationship between the content. So you see that rating is actually composed on star and numbers and things like that. So to set priority, I like this little metaphor, which is using the plane luggage. Usually when you travel long distance, you have 3 kinds of luggage. You have your hand luggage. Your hand luggage is going into the under your seat. It's something super important. It's something that you always have with you all of the time. You have direct access to that in the plane. So usually your hand luggage is your top priority content, is anything that is super important for your users, anything that is super important for your trip, your smartphone, your wallet, your boarding pass, maybe a book, an iPad, a bottle of water, something. Then you have cabin luggage. Cabin luggage would be kind of secondary content. This is important because you can reach out to the cabin luggage during the flight, but you don't have direct access. You need to wait until the flight took off and things like that. But it's also super important because you can put some interesting thing in the cabin luggage. Usually when you travel, they tell you, okay, put enough clothes to survive 2 days in case they lose your checked-in luggage. Trust me, it happened. So then you have checked in luggage, and this is kind of the less important items. Usually you put there all of your clothes and the thing that you could live without for 2 days in case it takes them time to find your luggage or something like that. So how do you decide which content goes where? You need to understand what is the most important content for users. And in order to do that, you need to do user research. So this is the kind of thing that you work while doing interview, like doing priority workshops with the users. You can do card sorting. There's a lot of different tools. It's a little bit out of the scope of this talk, but user researcher, we have a lot of tools to help us kind of understand the user need and understand what content they need in order to accomplish this goal. So back to my example, what goes under my seats? Well, the photo, because we're talking about the cooking recipe website, and you need a really great picture of your recipe if you want people to try it out. The name, obviously, you want to know what you're going to cook. And also reviews are important as well, because they create this kind of social bias. People trust other people's opinions. So if you see a cooking recipe with a super good rating, you're more inclined to actually click on that than the cooking recipe with less review or like poor reviews. What's going into the hold? Well, the metadata on the right. This is why we decided not to show them on the small version of the component. So again, I want to insist, think wisely before deciding not to show some content for a specific site. Do your user research. You can also use something called progressive disclosure. The idea is if you have a lot of content, you could display it progressively. Usually, if you think about e-commerce websites, like all of the specific technical details, things like that, is hidden behind an accordion. So the content is not gone. The content just needs the user to do one extra click to see it. So this is something that could work as well. So far I've used my component to adapt the layout to different screens and viewport size. But what if I want to go beyond that? Could we actually reuse those kind of components from different layouts? So meet the idea of modular content. Again, for a few years, a lot of years actually, we were designing whole pages at different screen size, and we discovered that it was not efficient. So today we tend to design more of a system of reusable components that we are going to make work with one another in our design systems. So the question is, if I take this component, I'm going to use it for the small viewport, but can we reuse this somewhere else? We could use it as teasers in a kind of season thematic recipe page if you want to have this kind of card layout, which is super trendy at the moment. We could say that this exact same component could be used on desktop in a sidebar, for instance, in a blog, where I would, again, want to have a few teasers to show the different recipes. It could also be used, again, in super big screens, directly in the recipe page as kind of a slider of related recipes. Again, you want to keep your user on your website most of the time. So if they don't like the recipe, it's usually a good idea to provide them extra content like, oh, you might like this recipe instead of this and this and this. So you see there's actually a lot of different places where I could reuse these small components, and it's not just kind of the mobile component anymore. It becomes this kind of wider concept of a really super reusable component. Sarenza has a good example of that. If you take a look at their sidebar, they were actually super smart. The mobile version of the sidebar and the desktop is the exact same thing. The only thing that changes is that on mobile, it's full screen, and on desktop, it takes like 25% on the desktop, and they floated it left. And that's it. So this component, to adapt it, the only thing they had to change is like 2 lines of CSS, and this component was working as a mobile filter and as a desktop sidebar. Pretty genius, right? So how do we build, design those reusable components? Again, content modeling, understand your content. So let's take a kind of easier example. I needed to design this thing that we call entity link. It's a link that is going to open an operation in our system. And if I take a look at the content model, it has an entity name, it has an ID number, it has an icon, and it's globally a link. When you click on it, you open the operation. I had to design a list of those. But when designing this, I asked myself, are there variations of other content this component for also the contract and the counterpart. Then I'm trying to identify, are there other places where I could reuse that? So I was tasked to design the bookmark tile. So the idea of a bookmark tile is that users can bookmark stuff in the interface, and then on the homepage, we show them the last bookmarks. It's kind of a quick way for them to find the things they work on again and again and again. And when designing my bookmarks, I was wondering, okay, are there any other place in our interface where I actually have this list of different entity links? And we have this concept of a quick search, which is when the user is entering a few letters or numbers in the search, we have Elasticsearch and we show them the 5 most relevant results. And it's this exact same structure. It's a list of entity links. So now I have like this component, I can decline in 3 different kind of flavors, and I can also reuse it in 2 different places. And then if I keep on digging, I discovered that this search bar is also in every internal page. So again, I could reuse the same component, but this time it's displayed in a 360 container. So I'll still need to adapt that to make it smaller for this internal search. So from one component, I have 3 different variations, and it exists in 2 different sizes for different uses. But for the developer, it's this exact same code. The idea is to make this work, code it once and make sure it works everywhere. And when you do this kind of exercise, like try to document components. This is a documentation for the component using the wireframes, but it's the same. So I have like my list of components on the left, and on the right, I have every page where we are going to use and reuse this component. So, okay, how technically does that work? How do we implement these kind of things? Jen Simmons in 2018 gave an amazing talk at an event apart. She spoke about something she called intrinsic web. And I really, really, really like this concept. So to kind of paraphrase a little bit what she explained, you could define intrinsic web as, instead of changing styles based on the screen, the size of a viewport or how big the screen of the device is, common components are able to automatically lay themselves out based on their own ideal condition. And this is where we start kind of rethinking the role as a designer. So as a designer at the beginning in the print industry, the idea was to do something and it was printed the exact same way. Today, my job as a designer is more to kind of show to my developers those ideal conditions. And then we discuss how it will adapt in the browser together. There's a lot of technical ways to do that, so I'm just going to give you 2 small examples. Adam Argal made a really, really cool demo, and this is this idea of a component that is able to automatically adapt. So you have this form with 2 fields and 1 subscribe button, and it's achieved without a single media query. See that I'm laying itself out whatever space or size there is around it. And this is achieved without a single media query used by using flexbox, shrink, and all of those properties. So it exists this concept of, I have 1 component, and if I put it in a small container, like the one on the left, it's going to have 1 specific layout. If I put it into a big container, it's going to have another specific layout. So the idea of giving a browser a set of instructions and then letting the browser set this up to match as much as possible this ideal situation. So you might wonder, okay, that's cute, there's only 3 elements. Can we do that with your example? Actually, we can. So Geoffrey Croft had a lot of fun with that. He basically built my component. So you see here, I have like my small, my medium, and my large version. And again, not a single media query is used. So if you take this component and you put it in a big screen, it will stretch and adapt to the big screen. If you put it in a small screen, it will be the small version. If you put it in a sidebar in a big screen, it could look something like that. So if you're interested, he wrote an article on CSS tricks to explain a little bit about that. Also, this talk has a transcript on my blog with all the links. So if you want to take a look after the talk, feel free to check all of the amazing demos. So there's a lot of ways to implement that. Like you can use Flexbox, grid layout, clam, min-max, a lot of CSS things. If you're interested in Google something like responsive layout without media queries, and you will be amazed by all the really clever techniques people came up with to do this kind of stuff. So what can we do actually technically with this? We can do the version on the left. We can have a component that is going to be able to rearrange the content up to a certain point. This is the layout I wanted on the right. So you see in the mobile version, I don't have the metadata. I have the save button on top of it. And this, unfortunately, we can't do it today without media queries, because it's about hiding content and switching stuff. So to achieve the one on the right, what we would actually need is something called container queries. It used to be called element queries, and we don't have those yet. So it would work kind of the same way as media queries, but instead of checking for a viewport size, we would check for a container or a parent size and adapt the content accordingly. Some smart people try to build some sort of fake container queries in JavaScript. So if you look at the right size, you have this card. And if I make the sidebar on the right bigger, you see the card adapting. And on the left, it's the same for the calendar. So here, again, it's the concept of we're not only adapting the content based on the user viewport, we are also adapting the content based on the parent. So maybe one day we'll have a container query. I hope so, because it would solve a lot of technical problem, and it will really help us build super reusable components. So whatever technical decision your team of development will take, the idea is, as designers, we really need to stop obsessing over this pixel perfection mockups and embrace the fluid intersect nature of the web. So I would say design in tools, Sketch, Figma, Photoshop if you want, whatever, but decide in the browsers. Like get your content, get your component as soon as possible in the browsers, and check with your developer about what kind of media queries you need to make sure that this content works properly in every condition, whether it's a screen or viewport size or a container size. So we've adapted our components to different viewport size, different container, but there's a lot of things that might go on with our design. Unfortunately, from talking a lot with developers and hearing a lot of frustration, most designers will stop at this. So they will build this happy, perfect content. So this is like my component, and here we go. Okay, thanks, bye. The problem is there's a lot of things that might actually happen to that content. So what if the title has 2 lines instead of 1? What do we do with the metadata on the right? Do we keep them at the top, or do we center them? This is a design decision. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but you need to answer this question because your developer will most certainly ask. Also, this little one. So in the first thing I showed you with the tiles, I had this same amount of content, kind of on purpose. But I was designing this in isolation. In the real example, as soon as I have like 2 lines of title, what happens to my cards? Does the card take the half of the content, like the example on the left? Or do we say, okay, all the card will take a kind of a min half or max half or something, and then we have a lot of white space? Again, I'm not saying any of those 2 is better than the other, but it's a design decision you need to take. What happens if some content is missing? If I don't have the image, do I have kind of a placeholder with the logo of the website? Or do I remove the image and stretch the rest of the content? Technically, we can do both. But again, design decision. Developer will ask about that. What happens if we don't have some values for some of the content? So here in this example, I just published the recipe. I don't have any grades at the moment. So do we display the little stars? But since we don't have any votes, it will look as if this recipe had a really bad grade, which it doesn't. We just don't have any votes yet. So do we say, okay, if there's no vote, instead of using this star components, we switch it to say no ratings available to make it a little bit clearer to the user? Or do we just remove this altogether? Again, to answer those questions, usually you will need to do some user research. But this is the kind of stuff that might happen with your components, like some content missing, things like that, or content that is not provided yet. So a few tips regarding content. Don't use lorem ipsum. If you need to use fake content, make sure that the structure of your fake content is close to the real one. I even know some company who are doing or are using machine learning on the real content in order to generate a fake set of data that could look as close as possible to the real one, but not using the real one so that there's no like issue with privacy and things like that. If you're a designer, ask the developers for the limit of the fields in the database. What's the minimum? What's the maximum? What's the average length of content? Just because in the database you can put 200 letters in the field doesn't mean that everyone will do that. So ask about that. And if something missing as a developer, please ask your designer, because we have our nose in those mockups all day long. And sometimes it's quite easy to forget about something. So don't be shy. Please ask us. What about states? So this is mostly for interactive components, but as a designer, it's also my job to provide all of the states. So if I take the example of an input, I have a lot of things to think about, like default over focus. Do we have a placeholder? Then once it's filled, I have the same states. And then if the field has an error, a warning, a success, things like that. So this is usually things you build in your design system once you document it, but still it needs to be done at some point. And then what about data population? Again, the happy path is the components is fully loaded, everything was fine, but things might happen. So first, it might take a little bit of time to load. So sometimes you might want to think about what's the loading state of my card, what's the loading state of my component. And then when there's no data to load, what do we do? What do we display? What's the wording? And this is super important because you want to have this kind of voice and tone that is consistent. So here in our interface, I have, there is no element title to display, which means that I can use that for a lot of things, and the element title will be replaced by the type of content it was supposed to display, which means that even if I have some other content, I can still use this kind of phrase to make sure that we always have the same structure for that. There is no operation to display. There is no contract to display. There is no document to display, something like that. So I keep my consistency into my design system as well, even on the level of the voice and tone and on the level of the content. Then data population again. What happens if we have an error? If at some point some API isn't replying and you can't actually show any content. Again, wording is important. Is there a way user might be able to fix it? Can they try to refresh the page? Can they call the supporters, do something like that? I'm not saying that this case will happen quite often. I'm saying that when you're designing some super complex component or that have a lot of things in the backend linked to them, you need to think about this kind of stuff. Then there's the amount of items. What happens if I only have one item? Do we have a minimum 8? Does the container get the height of the parent? Something like that. What if you have a big amount? So let's say I want to display more than 5. Do we just stretch the card vertically and display whatever will be there, but then you have a super high card? Do we say, okay, we display 5 elements and we have a scroll bar, or we display 5 elements and we have a pagination or something? Again, no perfect answer. I'm just like trying to show you that there's actually a lot of design decision that needs to be taken regarding real life contents outside of your design mockups. So I don't really need to design all of them. I designed those for the for the talk, but I just need to decide what will happen. So what I usually do is sometimes I just like add in the user story. Okay, if we have more than that, then we have a scroll bar, things like that. So the idea is, again, especially if you're working in an agile environment, be efficient. You might not need to design a lot of those states, but at least have them documented somewhere so that the developer team can understand what should happen. So designing and thinking behind the happy path. Know where the data come from, like ask your developers, because then you can know if something might go wrong. Investigate the amount of data that might get displayed, and investigate what might go wrong with that particular data. So something that helps me a lot when designing those components is usually to build this kind of flow where I will see all the different steps a user will go through within those components. So this is my quick search component, or you remember, the one that is in the search. That uses the entity link. And we start here with a new search, and you see it's actually already quite complex for such a simple component. And if I follow the different part, like, do I have more than 3 characters? Yes. Do we have results? Yes. If we don't have results, we go back to new search because we can't display anything. And then if I have more than 3 characters, I start entering into displaying some results. And if you follow this path, at some point you see that actually I might end up with this kind of no result page a lot. It helps me not forget about anything when I design. It also helps the developer understand what is going to happen when we trigger the search. Like here we say, okay, we wait for the user to have 3 different characters in order to trigger the search, things like that. Last but not least, how could we adapt the components to user-specific context and point in the journey? So you could imagine an interface that is going to adapt to the different steps in the process. Because if you have a kind of a process that have a lot of steps, depending on which step the user is in, the interface might not be exactly the same, but you might still use kind of the same components. So this is an example of a step-by-step application to bring your car to get it repaired outside of opening hours. So there's a lot of different steps. You open the gate, you park the vehicle, you have to sign a few documents. You need to get your rental car because at some point, if you leave your car at the garage, you want to go back home. So you can ask for a rental to go back and have a car for a few days during the repairs. Then you have to pick up the key and leave your key in a little box, etc., etc. So this is a step-by-step process, but you see that depending on the different steps I'm in as a user, I'm not going to see the same interface. And there's a few things you could actually detect. So you could imagine having GPS to detect if the user is in the right parking location, things like that. You can also think about e-commerce apps like Amazon, for example, the page with the tracking of the parcel. Depending on the moment in the flow, it will not show you the same thing. So once you purchased, you're usually in this step where the person is preparing your order. Then when the order is shipped, you start having more and more content and different content. You have you can track the parcel. You usually have this little timeline that shows you where the parcel here is, when it's going to arrive, things like that. So for one component or one page, depending on the kind of point in the journey your user is in, you might be able to adapt. Also, remember that mobile phones especially have a lot of different sensors. So we could imagine using those device sensors to adapt to user environment. If you take a look at most of the current GPS application, for instance, they are able to detect if the user is in a tunnel, and if the user is in a tunnel, so using GPS, but also usually ambient light in the car, they're able to switch the interface to dark mode, to avoid having this super bright interface in your eyes while actually driving in a dark tunnel. If you think about adapting a bike rental app, before the journey, as a user, you're looking for parking spaces where there's actually available bikes. While riding and when you stop your ride, you're actually looking for places and stations where there's free space so that you can leave your bike, things like that. So depending on the situation, if you are before or during your ride, we might not show you the exact same time of components and things like that. So you could imagine all those things actually about adapting components to really, really specific user environment by using all of those sensors that we have built into our mobile phones. I have a whole talk on that, by the way, if you're interested about what can our mobile phones do today in the browser about all of these kind of APIs. And you could see there's a lot of interesting things we could adapt. Last but not least, we could kind of adapt to user needs and expectation across the journey. If you think about the boarding pass, the information you want to see in the boarding pass might not be the same if you are like 2 days before your trip versus 1 hour before the trip. So 2 days before the trip, you might be interested, of course, in the date of the trip. Make sure you actually go to the airport on the right date, the boarding time, so that you can arrive on time. And you're also interested in the city, but also in the specific airport. If you're like in Berlin, you want to know to which one of those airports you're going to go. Same for London. There's a lot of airports there. And I think there's a lot of other cities in the world where you have a lot of airports. So a few days before, as a user, you're interested in, okay, I need to go to the airport on time. 1 hour before the flight, we kind of hope you're at the airport, otherwise you might miss your flight. So your context shifted. Since you are at the airport, you usually, as a user, might not be that interested into seeing the airport code in a big bold, unless you want to double check that you are the right one. What you're interested in now is like boarding time, but also terminal, gates, seats, things like that. So those information could be a little bit bigger for this component. And if we adapt the same exact component for a smartwatch, we could actually split this in 2 different sections. So you could have the same thing that I have here at the top here displayed directly. And then when the user swipes, they get the QR code that they need to go through security checks and everything. So this last part is kind of experimental because it would mean that I change the UI based on user context, which might go against something we call predictability of the interface, which is people get used to have button information, stuff like that, somewhere in the interface. If you change it all the time, it might be a little bit confusing. So be careful with that. I would heavily user test that and see if it's interesting to implement or not. Also, no one likes I know better than your interface. So always use this to manage this adaptive feature. So this is a screenshot from Google Community Forum where there's a user who is complaining about the GPS automatically switching from drive to walk. And this person apparently is doing delivery. And the fact that it's automatically switching whenever they get close to the delivery area is causing them a lot of trouble because they need to deliver things super fast, and it makes them actually waste some time. And I know that in the delivery industry, people are tracked all the time and people are super stressed and they have like bonuses based on how quick they can deliver stuff. So this is something super important. So it might seem trivial to say, oh, but it makes me waste 2 minutes or something. But on a whole day of delivery, that might be a lot actually for this kind of users. So make sure you user test that and you allow people to manage those adaptive features and opt out of them if they need to. So again, I love to repeat myself, but you need deep understanding of your user needs and behavior to build this kind of adaptive experiences. So user research. As UXers, we have something we call user journey. So the idea behind the user journey is to map the different steps and phases of a journey. And usually when I try to build these adapted features, I'm interested in the journey phase. Like, is it the beginning of the journey? At which part of the journey is my user? What actions are my user doing in this specific journey, the pain point, and obviously the touch points, the touch point being the devices and the different channels. Last but not least, you could imagine adapting your interface, adapting your component based on machine learning, algorithm, prediction, big data. And I'm honestly not a big fan of being tracked and big data, so I'm asking you to use that with caution. But if you take an example at the moment, and I Googled reproduction rates in private mode, but Google knows I'm in Luxembourg because of my IP. And at the moment, you see in yellow the results around epidemiology versus in purple the results around demographic. Because there's the notion of reproduction rates in both epidemiology and demography. And I think due to the COVID situation, everyone is trying to understand what the hell does these reproduction rates mean. Every media is talking to us about that. So what happened here is those results are actually adapted based on prediction on what did other user look for and their behavior at a specific time. I'm quite sure that if I was looking for this like 2 years ago before the whole COVID, the purple one, so the ones about reproduction rate in demography, might actually have been a little bit higher, that they're higher up in the ranking than they are at the moment. So to sum it up, try to think beyond screen sizes. Again, don't use specific device sizes to adapt for your media queries. Adapt them based on the content. Build reusable components that can lay themselves out based on their own ideal condition. Flexbox, grid layout, a lot of things. Design beyond happy path, happy content. As designers, it's super important because we need to get out of Sketch, Figma, or Adobe XD, whatever design tool you're using, and get this content out in the browser to see what it really, really looks like and what we need to adapt. Connect user research and use content model information architecture to take this kind of design decisions. Where do we place the content based on the different screen sizes, on the different container size, on the parent size, things like that. And in the end, it's a collaborative process with your development team. So there's a lot of communication involved today. If you want to build truly adaptive content that truly adaptive components that will be able to adapt to all of that. So thanks a lot. And yeah, all the transcript of this talk, the links are already on my blog. So stephaniewalter.design if you want to get the links, especially like usually people are super interested to see the link with the Flexbox demos and everything.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. And here is some virtual applauses for you. Yeah. Yeah. And just a second, Stephanie, I will say one thing in Russian, and then I will continue to talk about in English again. Да, ребят, важная вещь, которую нужно отметить, что мы сегодня, так как у нас начались открытые дни, мы будем снова за вопросы дарить книжки. Вот, поэтому не стесняйтесь, задавайте ваши вопросы, и потом мы, соответственно, уже придем к спикеру и спросим, какой вопрос ему кажется самым классным, и, соответственно, вам будем потом высылать тем или иным образом книжки. So, okay. And Stephanie, we'll back to you. And now we'll have some Q&A session. And Sasha, let's ask the first question.
Okay, again, thank you, Stephanie, for your talk. It was so wonderful to hear the designers that do it the right way.
Thank you.
Yeah, saying the right things. Yeah, we have a few questions. Usually we, as developers, we have to implement designs and we don't have a lot of freedom to change something because it was signed with another design team, with the client, with other part of the team. So we have to work with what we have. So how we should, or propose designers to think differently, to think not like there are things that we want to change, and there is the reason how we should teach them or ask them to change maybe things, or how we should do it.
Usually what I try to do is nothing gets validated. I don't work in agency anymore. At the moment I work internally, but when I was working for clients and in the agency, nothing was ever validated by any client before I showed it to the developers. So usually we had like a team meeting, and we also do that in Agile. We have these meetings every weekly where we call, I don't remember the name of the meeting, but whatever. It's a meeting where I show the mockups to the developers and I explain to them like the different design decision, and then we discuss about technical implementation and everything. And also, you remember the content modeling? Most of the time I would already kind of involve the developers in the content model. Because at the moment I have like super complex API, and I know that some of the content I see in the interface that we have today, we might not be able to have it tomorrow because of technical constraints, things like that. So most of the time, I really try as a designer to involve the developers upfront in the process to make sure that once you validate something with the client, we can actually build it with the client. So yeah, it's a lot about communication and trying to get everyone around the table as soon as possible.
Yeah, thank you. I'm all for that every time. Andrew?
Yeah, next question. So how do you think the developers and designers can communicate more together in some component way? So I suppose that developers understand the component way in their side very well, but I suppose that designers think about it a little bit different. So how do you think we can help each other?
I think actually the designer got quite better at understanding components due to the way the design tool work today. So we used to have like Photoshop and everything was pixels, and you had to copy paste layers and stuff like that. It was a nightmare. But today, like most of the modern design tool, they have this concept of symbols, or I don't remember how it's called in other ones, which is kind of the same thing as components for developer. Is like one thing you build once, you have it into a library, and then you actually drag and drop it, and you can override some things like titles, icon, things like that, depending on how you've built it. So I think as a developer, if I needed to explain components to designer, I would try to use the design language and say, okay, look, you've got these symbols, you've got this library, so you're already kind of familiar with this notion of reusing things. And then again, it's about discussion. So I've been working a lot with developers who are using, what's the name? UI frameworks, like Material React or Material, the other one, Angular. And then it's about knowing as a designer there's a framework that's going to get used, and then talking to the developer early in the stages, okay, what component could we use to do that? Or what component could we use to do that? I still have a lot of discussion today with my developer about the components. We have this, we have a really specific business. Like I work for a bank, so Material UI is not gonna cover all of our components needs. So we need to build custom components. But even when building custom component, we have a lot of discussion. Like we have this component we call a wizard bar, which is basically a big bar with all of the links to other tools that our user needs. And this is a little bit complicated because they can open it, they can favorite stuff. So it's not just a list of buttons. And even there, when discussing with the developer, we discovered that actually the structure is really, really close to the structure that we have in models. We have kind of a top title with a cross on the right that we can close. It uses the same kind of layout and background as something that is used in the cards, things like that. So we again have a lot of exchanges about how can I make sure that I reuse the component I already have, and how can they also make sure they reuse the components?
Okay, thank you. But is it necessary? How do you think to understand each other's instruments for designers and developers? So, do designer need to know to get acquainted to Angular, for example, and developer?
No, I'm a designer and talk to you about Flexbox and grid layouts, but because I'm curious. So I think designers should at least understand how the browser is working. They should understand, okay, you can do this really, really cool thing with Flexbox. This is possible and this is possible. And I don't think you need to understand the specifics of React or Angular, because at the end of the day, whether you're using PHP, React, Angular, whatever, at the end, it's still something in the browser. So I think they need to understand how the browser works, for sure, like flexibility and this kind of intrinsic kind of way the components will lay themselves out. But whether the component is built in Angular and React doesn't change a lot. Like I know a lot of teams who are working on design systems, and they are building the components in the design tool, and they're building the HTML CSS version of the component. And then some other team grab this HTML version to build it into a React component, or to build it in an Angular, even to build it into kind of an iOS React Native, something like that. But yeah, in the end, I think as a designer, it's important to understand, to be kind of proficient in the language of how do browser work, what can we do with the browser. But I don't think you need to know Angular. Also, you don't have time for that. It's like if you do user research, usability testing, also you might work a little bit on the UI. You need to maintain design system, things like that. It's really complicated, to, on top of that, be super good at Angular, React, and everything.
Okay, thank you. Sasha?
Yeah, we have some fun question for you. What is your favorite pizza?
I don't know how it's called, and I think people will hate me, but I think Domino's Pizza had this pizza with cream, chicken, and barbecue sauce. I'm sorry to Italian people. Really, really sorry.
Okay. Andrew?
And next question, how do you think when it's a good idea to use media queries and breakpoints, or we just should abandon them in the future when they come to the browsers?
We can abandon media queries. As I showed you, like there's so much you can do with Flexbox, because it's about flexibility. So you can reorder things around. Like in Flexbox, you have orders. You can say, okay, I want to switch the title. I want it on top and on bottom, but you still need a trigger. So the idea is not to ditch media queries, is to use them with this kind of super intrinsic value to kind of build this web where it's able to adapt. And I kind of hope we'll have container queries one day. Also, if you want to make big changes based on the viewport, like as I said, if you want to have this button on top of the component, you need to completely change the layout. You need to have a position absolute or something. So we still need media queries. I'm not saying don't use media queries. I'm saying take a look at Flexbox, grid layout, clamp, and all of those min-max, because there's a really lot of cool things you can do. And then you can have super flexible component that will adapt also to the container. But yeah, you still need media queries.
Okay.
Yeah, you told us very shortly about user journeys, but how we should do, or designers should do it in the right way. I mean, what tricks and tips do you use when you create it? What tools do you use for creating them?
For creating user journey?
Yeah, maybe you like some special flow or something. How we should plan it? Yeah,
sure. So user journey, usually you need to understand the journey. So you start with the user research. And with the user research, what you're looking for is patterns. So if you want to build user journey, of course, during your interview, you're going to ask specific questions, things like that. So once you've got your user research, you're looking for patterns, and based on those patterns, you can actually define the different phases of the journey of your users. Also, if you can use like quantitative data, sometimes you can ask marketing people about all of the channels and things like that. So it's usually a mix between qualitative data from user interview and quantitative data from the different like analytics. And also sometimes you have this, I don't remember the name, but people can give feedback directly on your website. You have customer support, so things like that. So you need to gather all the information you can about what your user are actually doing on your interface. And then it's about mapping the whole journey. So usually it's a team exercise you're doing with a few other designers. It takes a lot of time, to be honest. And you will go back and forth. Like there's no perfect way. Usually I like to at least start with the main steps in the journey. But I was working in for this specific feature. And we were mapping, we kind of did this pre-user journey where we kind of mapped what we think was going to be the user journey in order to be able to ask the right question during the interviews. And we discovered that we had a lot of in-between steps that we needed to add into this journey. There was something called like human notification. So it was kind of a simple feature. It was about tasks and people getting notified that they needed to validate a task. And while doing the interview, we discovered that one of the steps of the journey was actually people get notified by secretaries or assistants because the notification system is too slow. And they get the notification at the end of the day. So in our journey, we have a new step, which is kind of getting notified by other people. We have also other steps like pre-approval thing where we thought they were doing everything in the interface, but actually they're doing a lot of things outside of the interface by exchanging emails and things like that. So it's really about gathering the data about specific tasks, specific feature, what do people do, finding the patterns, and then mapping this. So it's back and forth. Regarding tools, when I was not remote, I was using Post-its on a whiteboard. At the moment, since we are still working remotely due to the current situation, we're using online tools like Miro. I think we just say Miro. So it's online Post-it board.
Okay, and just final question. We are running out of time. Could you please share the link to CodePen from presentation somewhere, and we will share it with.
How do I share it?
So you can send it via email, and I will.
Okay, sure. Okay. I thought you wanted me to share it right now.